As you're well aware, we're in that period of time known as Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, the time between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And we're particularly located, as you can tell from your bulletin, Shabbat Shuvah. It's the Sabbath of return. Return to me, God said to us. We looked at this text a couple nights ago, Malachi 3. And it says, the Lord will return to you. Turn us, Lord, let us return, we just said. Renew our days as of old. It's a special time in our Jewish calendar. It's a time for reflection, for introspection, for self-examination. It's a time for renewal and reinvigoration. Now, the texts that we've read, the parashiot, over the last several weeks, have been from Deuteronomy, or Devarim. As I mentioned earlier, it was Moses' farewell speech. It was his closing challenge to his people. It was, in fact, a recap of what God had done for them and what now God expected from them. It was a challenge to them to renew their commitment to the covenant from God and to renew their commitment to the God of the covenant. And, in fact, to turn words, Devarim, into actions. And one of the ways you can translate actions as well is with the Hebrew term, Devarim. It's almost Yom Kippur. Friday night we'll start that observance. It reminds us that we stand before God and we need to reaffirm our relationship with God. In other words, this is a time of year that's ripe for renewal. Now, 2 weeks ago, the parsha, the portion, concluded in this way. It says it was on the plains of Moab that Moses restated the covenant that the Lord had made with the people of Israel at Mount Horeb. He summoned all Israel before him and told them, "You have seen with your own eyes the great plagues and mighty miracles the Lord brought upon Pharaoh and his people in the land of Egypt." Some powerful stuff he did. And then he goes on to say 2 verses later, "For 40 years God has led you through the wilderness, yet your clothes haven't become old and your shoes haven't worn out." And that's as much of a miracle as the one they had seen in the Exodus. Tremendous stuff that the people had observed. And then last week's parsha begins, "All of you are standing today before the Lord your God." You're standing here to enter a covenant. Probably in view of the context, a better way to translate that would be to renew a covenant with the Lord your God. He goes on to say he wants to confirm you today as his people and to confirm that he is your God, just as he promised to your ancestors. And this covenant is not with you alone as you stand before him today, but with all future generations of Israel as well. As our ancestors stood before God and re-entered that covenant, renewed that covenant, he said it's not only for them, but all future generations as well. That's us, gang. So we can say, or I can say to you, all of you are standing today before the Lord your God. And earlier on, he'd even described it more specifically. He called it this very day. In other words, the covenant was being renewed on that day for a new generation that was taking upon itself the responsibility of Torah, the responsibility of faithfulness to God, to the God of the covenant, as well as the covenant of God. Hence the stress on this day, both in that text and in the one I just read to you. You stand today, it said, all of you, before the Lord your God. He said all of Israel, those of us as Jews, and even the stranger within your camp, all those who were not Jews who joined with that community at that time. Now, in many synagogues around the world, you will see up front, or you'll see it above the ark, the words in Hebrew, Da lifnei mi'ata omed. Know before whom you are standing. Know before whom you are standing today. In other words, today is an important time of covenant renewal, perhaps even an urgent time. The book of Habakkuk 2, verse 20, reminds us just before the amazing psalm that concludes that book, the Lord is in his holy temple, and so the whole earth stands silent before him. The Lord is in his holy temple, and we too need to remember that we stand silent before him, especially at this important time of year. Now, toward the end of that parsha from 2 weeks ago, we encounter a statement by Moses that must have struck an interesting chord with Israel. We read in Deuteronomy 29, verse 3, these words, "Yet to this day," listen to this carefully, "the Lord has not given you a mind to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear." Through all the miracles, the revelation at Sinai, the pillars of fire and of smoke, the manna, the splitting of the sea, the destruction of the Egyptians, the Israelites had not yet fully comprehended the grandeur of God? How's that possible? It's simply inconceivable that if people who had experienced such wonders still remained unclear about God. However, that is precisely what Moses meant to convey by those words. Yes, the people had experienced firsthand the power and the might of God. But as many of our rabbinic commentators on this verse write, blood and fire and pillars of smoke do not necessarily create a relationship with God. The generation of the Exodus demonstrated that the ultimate proof of God's existence, the miracles, do not or did not necessarily promote the ideal covenant relationship. You know, there's a lesson for us here as well, because too often in modern, at least Western religion, I won't speak for anything beyond that, because I don't know too much about much beyond that, but in modern Western religion, there's an awful lot of focus or emphasis on the wonders and the miracles and the splashy stuff. And our commentators, the rabbis of old, point out very astutely, that's not what produces a relationship with God. In the 16th century, a rabbinic commentator writes on this verse of ours, and I quote, "You witnessed all those great wonders, but only appreciated their full significance just now, at this time, after they had receded from view, as if you had, to this point, lacked sight and hearing." He's talking about the crew who's looking back 40 years later. He's observing that the people of Israel did not understand the miracles because they needed distance from them. It was their time in the desert. They're wandering. They're gaining perspective and experience. They're growing as a people that allowed them to appreciate the full significance of the miracles. And friends, as part of this community, some of you have been around longer than others, it's helpful as we look back over the years to better appreciate what God has done for us through all those years, as we stand ready to renew our own commitment to God, as these people did in the text from last week, and as we do and need to do at this time in our calendar. The previous month, Elul, has traditionally been the month for introspection, a month to examine our relationship with God. And the Yamim Noraim and Shabbat Shuvah even more sharply focus our attention on this. It's a period to develop as individuals, to emerge like Israel did from the desert, with the mind, the ears, and the eyes we need to approach Yom Kippur and celebrate our renewal before our God. Now that raises an interesting question, because we understand, I would hope, the general concept. What exactly is it that we need to see and hear, to remember and to understand? Now here I'm going to draw on some wisdom that is, again, accumulated by some rabbis, but in this case, they're rabbis from just a handful of years ago. But sometimes there's wisdom there as well. It comes from a book called Rethinking Synagogues, a New Vocabulary for Congregational Life. And the author there, Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman, gives us one very important suggestion. He says this: more than any other institution, the synagogue has sustained American Jewry. The Jewish future depends on it. But to thrive rather than just survive, synagogues are challenged to break free from the mold and reemerge, now listen to what he says, as a center of the sacred, where creativity, spirituality, and ethics are central. This reemerging synagogue, he says, needs to be described as sacred community. And it needs to be a place, I would add, where we can find sacred depth. Now, the author contrasts sacred community with what we might call the market community that's so dominant in our times, or what we might call as well consumerist culture. And so he writes, the everyday is what we use as means to ends. The sacred, however, exists as its own end. Now, friends, we all realize this, that much good may proceed from a sacred community. But it is not constituted just to get the job done or to promote programs. Sacred community, friends, is devoted to certain tasks. But these can be realized only in a sacred atmosphere, not in a market community where people weigh value by the list of products, or in that society, deliverables that they think their donations or involvement are buying. Rather, congregations are community for its own sake. So our congregation should not be a means to an end, a collection of programs and projects and benefits, as valuable as those might be. Rather, the community needs to be a gathering of individuals into a shared calling, vision, and commitment. You see, once a member begins to ask, what's in it for me, he or she has left the realm of sacred community and returned to the realm of secular consumerism. You see, God calls us to something different, to sacred community that people belong to because they love it and because they find God there. We're at that point in the readings for the year where Moses is about to stand at a mountain called Pisgah to get a look at the land which he was not allowed to enter. The author uses that mountain Pisgah and develops an acronym out of it to give us an idea for what would be important for us to achieve the promised land, as he puts it, for our synagogues. And so its letters define 6 congregational tasks that we too can commit, perhaps recommit to, as we stand before God and renew our relationship with him. P stands for prayer, tefillot, the service, the time when we get together as we have this evening and respond to God. I, he says, is for institutional creativity or vitality, a community that's alive. S, that's fairly simple. That's study. That's the Torah study. That's the yeshiva and seminary that we can access so easily. That's the adult educational seminars that will be coming up after the holidays. We have plenty of opportunity there. G, that's good deeds. We call them mitzvot. It's what Yeshua reminded us were so important in our lives when he says, people will see your mitzvot, the way in which you live and act, and they won't heap praise on you. They'll glorify the Father in heaven. In fact, he's simply rephrasing Deuteronomy 4, where God says, if you follow these instructions, the nations of the world will look at you and say, wow, I want that. I want to know that God. Mitzvot. A, it's that atmosphere of sacred depth that hopefully we all encounter when we come here and enter into an experience, an encounter with God. H is for healing. There's a good rabbinic or Hebrew term called tikkun. It has to do with repairing. It has to do with healing. It has to do with wholeness. Since the W is silent there, that also stands for it. The H also stands for that. Synagogue transformation in the sacred community, how does it take place? Well, there is an essential that the Rabbi suggests to us, and he says welcoming is essential to this transformation. Welcoming in 3 areas. A welcoming atmosphere, integrating warm hospitality into every aspect of the congregation's or the community's life. Now, Patrice and I just returned, as she suggested, from teaching in Berlin. This was our 3rd time there, and we had the opportunity, as we have the other 2 times, to join with the Messianic Synagogue in Berlin. We felt completely at home, even though we've only been there 3 times, because they have a wonderful way of welcoming, of warm hospitality in every aspect of the congregation's life. We do pretty good at that ourselves. But in all fairness, having just returned, there's room for improvement. We are still better than a lot of other places we've been to, I will say that. So welcoming atmosphere, welcoming worship, services that draw people into the riches of Jewish tradition and a true encounter with God, like our ancestors had in the wilderness. And we'll remember that, replicate that hopefully during the holiday of Sukkot, because it's Sukkot to help us remember that. We can get drawn into the riches of an experience and encounter with God. Friends, that only happens if you allow yourself or put yourself into that place. We've been around to a number of Messianic synagogues. Richard, close your ears. And we've never seen a cantor who's able to draw you in quite as powerfully as he does. A welcoming membership, by the way, we say thank you. A welcoming membership. In other words, helping people become real participants in community life rather than merely consumers in the pews. And let me be clear here about this particular synagogue. We welcome Jews and we welcome Gentiles. We welcome women and we welcome men into full participation with us in this grand project. But this grand project, this Jewish gig, this is an important warning, is not always easy. And there are two high Qs, Jewish high Qs. Perhaps will help us understand this. It's hard to tell under the lights, white yarmulke or male pattern baldness. Passover, left the door open for the prophet Elijah. Now our cat is gone. It ain't always easy, gang. But we need to see the big picture, the vision. And for more on our vision, on the back table is our vision statement. And we'll talk some more about some specifics of that vision, as Caleb has just told us, at our congregational meeting. So how do we fit? What is your part in all this? Well, those of you who've been through membership class had better know this, but I will not assume that you have remembered this. Those of you who haven't had the privilege of going through that, you'll find that this makes some sense. Three things: active participation, natural proclamation, and regular contribution. Let me unfold each of those very briefly. Active participation. The book of Hebrews tells us, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Don't forget getting together. It uses a specific term. In Greek, it's episynagoge. And you don't need to know a whole lot of Greek to understand what that term means. Basically, the author is saying, show up at the synagogue. Be active. Be there regularly. Natural proclamation. It's built not only on our commission as Jews and those who associate with us to be a priesthood to the nations. Can't do that effectively if you're not talking about what it is that you're supposed to be representing as a priest, but Yeshua tells us the same thing. Natural proclamation, as we walk through life, encounter the people in our lives, as part of natural conversation. And then there's regular contribution, three areas here. The first is rather straightforward, that's giving financially. That's why the blue boxes are in the back. But it also involves giving spiritually. Each of us, God has given one or more what he calls spiritual gifts or giftings. And God's very specific as to how these are to be used. The Rabbi tells us in Ephesians 4. They're to be used to help prepare each other for serving God, to help each of us for each of us to help somebody else achieve their full impact in serving God as we grow together as a body. And then there's giving emotionally. That's Hebrews 10:24. As we go around encouraging one another. Now, last time I checked, this word encourage, whether it's Greek, Hebrew, or English, didn't have any negative valence or connotation to it. In other words, it didn't involve negative stuff, whether it's in here or coming from here, or what we observe. Encouraging, that's giving emotionally. Those are ways to get involved in this particular important role. And what's the ultimate purpose? I'm glad you asked. Back to the text from 2 weeks ago. Deuteronomy 28, verse 9. It says, if you will observe the mitzvot, the guidelines and instructions of the Lord your God, if you follow his ways Listen to this. Then all the people of the earth will see that God's presence is with you. Wow. If we follow God fully, others will look at us as a community and as members of that community and say, God is with you. I'll say that again. Wow. In other words, living correctly for our ancestors in the land of Israel and for us here in the community was not done for its own sake. There was a purpose to the nation living according to God's teaching. It was so that he would be known, as the text says, by all the peoples of the earth. You see, in ancient Israel, there were people who would travel through the land of Israel as merchants or as diplomats or simply as travelers. Therefore, they saw the way that Israel lived. With love and loyalty to God as a national motivation, Israel was then a place to reflect the reality and relevance of God to the pagan peoples who had strayed a long way from that one true God. And as it was for our people then, remember our text for the last 2 weeks keep telling us today, in this day, that is our role today as well, to give people a glimpse of God when they encounter us in community. In the book of Devarim, as we come to its close, Moses is preparing the people, that generation, let me put it for you this way, as for the real world. You see, they were leaving their wilderness honeymoon with God, where God took care of absolutely everything. In Israel, they would have to work, they would have to build, they would have to fight battles, they would have to produce their own food, and still give all the credit to God. And through it all, they were now, Moses is telling them, to make Israel into God's home, a home that would be attractive to others. This, too, friends, should be our covenant commitment, what we rededicate ourselves to. Making this a place that will attract others to our God. So, since the text keeps telling us today or this day, it is an appropriate time to renew our covenant and our covenant commitment to our God today. Now, I heard this said a number of years ago, and at least for the next couple years, but probably not much longer than that, this will make sense. But given the nature of our technological society, it's passing from fashion. I heard it said that yesterday is like a canceled check. Tomorrow is like the promissory note. Yeah, I know nowadays people don't always get canceled checks. That's what I was talking about. Yesterday is like the canceled check. Tomorrow is like the promissory note. But today, friends, that's cash on hand. So it's time to cash in. It's time for covenant renewal. As it was when the people returned to the land under Nehemiah, and the text says there in Nehemiah 9 and 10, as they reflect back from a distance on what God has done. They said, because of all this, we again promise to serve the Lord, and we put our names to this covenant. And then it says, I, Nehemiah the governor, signed the covenant. The others signed it also. Because of all this, we again promise to serve the Lord, and we put our names to the covenant. They signed the covenant, friends. Now, it's your turn. The time is right for renewal. Da'al lifnei, mi atah omed. Know before whom you are standing, and commit yourself to him once again in covenant connection. Take the next minute or so for a time of reflection and response in silence, please.